All right, thank you everyone for coming to the 350 California Housing Webinar Part 2. We're very excited to have you. My name is Ben. I will be the moderator for tonight. We also have Michael Roshmez. Did I pronounce that right?
Close enough.
Michael Roshmez and Marie Chen here as co-hosts. This event is sponsored by 350 Bay Area Action, 350 South Bay LA, 350 Ventura County, and 350 San Diego. So thank you all to our supporters and 350 chapters across the country, across the state, and we're very excited to have you here. So tonight we're talking about housing policy in California and how it relates to climate change and sort of what the question is about state housing policy and as far as climate advocates should be considering. We have three excellent speakers with us tonight. Our first speaker, Dr. Chris Jones, is director of the CoolClimate Network at UC Berkeley, where his research focuses on consumption-based emissions inventories, behavior change, and looking at state policies to address greenhouse gas emissions. He's been doing this work for about 15 odd years. He has a very extensive background. He's one of the leading climate experts on state policies and consumption-based emissions inventories. Our second speaker, Laura Raymond, is director of Alliance for Community Transit Los Angeles, or ACT LA. As director of ACT LA, Laura works on a range of housing, transportation, jobs, and climate issues in the LA area, prioritizing the interests of low-income communities of color when it comes to these considerations. And our third speaker, who is going to join us in a little bit, is Cassidy Denny. She's the legislative aide for State Senator Scott Wiener, who represents San Francisco, and she works on housing policy in the senator's office. And Senator Scott Wiener is very closely associated with a number of state housing legislation, including SB 35 and SB 50, that have been some of the more recent adventures of the state legislature into local housing policies. So like Michael mentioned earlier, we will have the chat disabled while our speakers are presenting so that they can present uninterrupted. Each speaker will have about 10 or 15 minutes to present, including time for questions. There's a link in the chat for you to submit your questions to the speakers, just a Google form, so we can go ahead and ask them those questions without disrupting their presentations. And then after the speakers have all presented, they're given their presentations, we'll have some time for breakout rooms where we can all discuss the bills of interest. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Chris to give your presentation.
All right, thank you, Ben, and thank you 350 and the organizers. And this is really a fascinating conversation we're going to have today. So I want to just jump right into it. And let me start sharing my screen here. All right. So as Ben mentioned, I'm the director of the CoolClimate Network at UC Berkeley, and we're a consortium of universities and nonprofit organizations, businesses, trying to get climate solutions out in the world, and particularly looking at household level, at business level, and community level emission reduction opportunities. We do some state level policy as well, but we're really focused on kind of the ground level action. And so this is kind of a pertinent topic today for us to be looking at housing policy. I think what we're most known for at CoolClimate is our carbon footprint calculator. And so just to give you a sense of where emissions come from, if you allocate all those emissions to final demand, so all the emissions from industry and commerce, as well as household emissions, if you allocate those all to who buys the products ultimately, which is households and government, it looks something like this. So this is a carbon footprint of the typical US household, about 50 tons of CO2. And you can see it's not just about transportation and energy, but it's also about the food we eat and the goods and services. So this is a full consumption inventory. If you multiply 50 tons of CO2 by all the households in the United States, you get something like 90% of the emissions, 85% of the total emissions. The rest are from government emissions, military, and all of the infrastructure. So just to put things in perspective, this is roughly the typical global household. So we left emissions there pretty similar for food, but people really don't drive very much. The energy is much less. Consumption of goods and services, certainly incomes are much lower, less than like 10,000, I think, per household. So just to give you a perspective, carbon footprints are very different depending on where you live. And here is where we need to get to globally by mid-century, ideally, in order to stabilize the climate. So from here to here, and you may argue that we need to do more than this in the United States because we've already done more than our fair share of emissions. So we need to get there at scale, and we need to get there very, very quickly. So if you want to learn about your own carbon footprint, you can go to coolclimate.org/calculator, and you can use this tool. Shameless plug there for our calculator. Let me get into the research underlying the tool, and where we can get into some urban planning policies relevant for this discussion. So this is the carbon footprint of the typical household at the block level or block group level in the Bay Area, a study we did for the Air District, and we've recently updated it for the city of San Francisco. And you can see that there's a huge difference in the size of carbon footprints, and also importantly in the composition of those carbon footprints. So how much is from air travel versus consumption versus food. And there's an up to a 5x difference even within cities of carbon footprints in the lowest carbon footprint neighborhoods to the highest carbon footprint. I wanted to geek out a little bit on how we come up with this because it's really relevant for our discussion on housing. So for the city of San Francisco, here are 6 variables, each of which contribute to every aspect of carbon footprints. I'm going to go into this a little bit. So income, as you might expect, vehicle ownership, of course, affects mainly how much travel you have, but it is correlated with some other aspects of consumption. The number of people in the home, so that's the size of the home. The household size is the number of people in the home. Rooms is the size of the home, so how many square feet. In this case, we're using rooms to figure out how big the homes are. Home ownership and education levels, interestingly. Each of these is going to impact your carbon footprint a little differently. When you roll that up, it looks something like this. In the carbon footprint of San Francisco, you see this very differentiation in where the carbon footprints are. So again, I said I was going to geek out on this. I think this is a relevant crowd for this. Just to think about things in this perspective. So the number of people in the home affects how much food you buy, how many, of course, your clothing. So each person has personal consumption expenditures, and those are related to the number of people in the home. Incidentally, those who live in urban core areas tend to have fewer people per home than those who live in this outlying suburbs. So making sure housing is appropriate for the higher number of people in the urban centers is an important consideration. Of course, income is highly correlated with carbon footprints. However, you need to think about if income levels are higher in the suburbs, as they tend to be, as those people perhaps move into urban core areas. And of course, we need to consider all the equity implications of that as well. They will tend to buy more based on their income level. However, this is really moderated by the size of the home. So the size of home affects how much furniture you're going to buy, how much stuff you're going to put in the home. Whether or not you own the home is going to contribute to the services that you purchase for the home, or whether you put furniture or make big investments in the home. Your college degree. Interestingly, those who have higher college degrees tend to spend more on consumption associated with social status, essentially traveling more, eating out more, entertainment services, and of course, spending more on your education. So all these aspects are really relevant to what people are going to be purchasing, and it affects each of these really differently, aspects of consumption. So here's a carbon footprint on the left of San Francisco, and we did this going back to 1990, compared to the US household on the right. And you can see, oops, I flipped that on the bottom. Sorry about that, it didn't come through. So I guess on the bottom, I got this reversed. US is on the left and San Francisco is on the right. Forgive me, I thought I had fixed that. But generally the story here is that if you live in this urban core area, which is San Francisco, your carbon footprints are going to be lower, certainly from transportation. The average vehicle ownership is about 1 vehicle compared to 2 statewide, and upwards of 3 in the outlying suburban areas. Homes are smaller. People own homes, they tend to own fewer homes, so that's an important consideration in the Bay Area as well. Of course, education levels are higher and income levels are higher, but that doesn't always translate to higher carbon footprints for some aspects of consumption. So the couple things I wanted to point out comparing the US to San Francisco is San Francisco emissions are less. And of course, we could have done this analysis for any city, and we have done this for every city in the US, but just using this as an example, emissions from transportation are, of course, much less than energy. However, the US emissions have been going down more quickly than California overall. And this is something to give us a bit of pause. With 500,000 people working kind of in the clean tech space and tens of billions of dollars, all the policy in California has managed to reduce emissions less quickly than the United States overall. And the reason why this has happened is because mainly decarbonization of transition away from coal, and of course our fossil fuel consumption is coming down nationwide because of fuel economy, and also other standards as well. But again, we need to like compare ourselves to what is the benchmark, and we're not doing great compared to the benchmark. We're actually doing a little less. So we've done the analysis for every city in the Bay Area, so you can look at that. I also wanted to point out that the mayor of San Francisco, the mayor of Oakland has been very proactive in terms of housing. At least the way she speaks about housing. She says, look, we know that our carbon footprint is more in Oakland than other cities. Of course, we have more people. And even though we know that bringing more people into Oakland is going to increase our carbon footprint, it's going to be better for the state overall and for globally. Because had those people, the same people lived elsewhere in California, their carbon footprints would be much higher. And that was really the point that we really picked up on in our analysis. And so we've done carbon footprint of every city and county in the United States. We can think about why emissions are different. Big thing that you notice, of course, is emissions are higher in the suburbs, as you'd expect, than in the urban core areas. And you see this everywhere you look in the United States. Importantly, though, if you add up the carbon footprints of all the people in the suburbs with all the people in the urban core, emissions are essentially the same. So like doing population density in the absence of controlling sprawl, it's kind of like pouring sand on a map. You put more sand in the middle and people just tend to spread out. So we need to do both simultaneously. You can't just do the urban infill. You've got to put controls in place to discourage sprawl. And I think that's really important. And some of the bills may do that we're discussing today, and some may not. And I have some concerns about what may actually happen in the real world. So when you compare carbon footprint reduction opportunities at different places like Tracy and Berkeley, Berkeley comes out, urban infill is a huge opportunity. And let me just describe that just briefly so we can move on to other speakers here. Basically, what we looked at is if carbon footprints of the same income level on the right here, we were looking at carbon footprints by income level, there's a pretty big range. So even at the high income level areas, had their carbon footprints, had they lived somewhere else, their carbon footprint would be higher than if they lived kind of below that line. So all of our urban infill locations are 15% below that line or more. So you can go to this tool in California, and it's actually coolclimate.org/scenarios, and you can compare the emission reduction opportunities of every city in California, or even every neighborhood. And on the left, we have Sacramento, and on the right, we're doing California overall. Now, what we want to look at here is that urban infill line on the left, and for Sacramento is the biggest single opportunity amongst all these intervention areas of policies of which they have local control. And California, because not every place in California is a good spot for urban infill, it rates a little bit lower. Again, this is under local control. If we now look at the total potential, not just within local control, but within the total reduction opportunity, urban infill is not as big of an opportunity as electric vehicle electrification and electrification overall, but we have a little bit less control over that, although we do certainly have some at the local level. And then you can kind of go through this tool and make other comparisons. One comparison I like to make, here's Sacramento, again, versus California, like what are the biggest opportunities overall? Here it's electric vehicles is the biggest opportunity statewide. I like to compare, for example, Sacramento with Berkeley. So Berkeley, by far and away, the biggest opportunity you can do is put more people there. And what we find in Berkeley is it's not just the downtown area, it's the hillside area has some of the biggest opportunities. If we can find a way to put more people on those existing properties, had they lived somewhere else at those essentially high income levels, their carbon footprints would be higher. And we make an important, critical, maybe perhaps not too realistic assumption that the people who live in that who infill will have the same demographic or the same income level at least as those who were previously there. So there's no displacement in our model. We just kind of assume similar households with similar consumption will be moving to that area. So it's a very simple assumption, but I think it helps us get a sense of the total policy kind of potential here. And just one other thing I like to say is that of the Of the total emission reduction potential that we have in California, and we've done published studies on this with LBNL, about 1/3 of it requires local involvement, requires local policy, requires local to activate your households and your businesses, and then local policy and urban planning. And so all of that's really important to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We have to think really thoughtfully about what we're going to do. And if we can reduce those emissions, we're also going to solve a big equity problem with pollution as well as carbon footprints. If we can actually meet our targets and get all of our energy from renewable sources, and we'll have this kind of, we'll clean up the disparities between these carbon footprint neighborhoods of who is contributing more, but we'll also simultaneously solve the pollution problems. And of course, people living in urban cores have to spend less on transportation. I think that's really important. They spend less on energy. And so if we can find a way to live more efficiently, even though their housing costs may go up, they're gonna have less money to spend that they'll have to spend on other aspects of their carbon footprint. We've got to do a lot very, very quickly. Essentially, the equivalent of the Great Recession and the COVID, like that's the scale that we need annually in order to solve our climate crisis. So we need to do a lot and we need to do it quickly. So that's all I have. I'm sorry if I took a little long. How are we doing on time?
We're doing good. We started 5 minutes late and then I gave a little spiel. So we're basically right on time. Thank you, Chris.
Sure.
I don't see any questions submitted. If you would like to submit a question, now's a really good time to do so. Putting the link back in the chat if anyone has questions for Chris. Let's see if we get anything there. But if not, we're going to go on to our next speaker, Laura Raymond.
Should I start or do we have questions?
No, we don't. Looks like we don't have any questions. So yeah, go ahead. Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Right, you're welcome.
And oh wait, we do have one question. Sorry, I just showed up. What percent EVs are in your chart?
In the Bay Area, it's only about 2% EV right now, and there's a lot of hybrids. Say, for example, in Berkeley, like traditional Priuses, etc. It varies by city. We have a project, Eco Data Lab, where you'll soon be able to go and look all that up and track these over time.
I think I remember seeing that in Berkeley, about 17% of new vehicle registrations are electric vehicles or hybrids or some combination thereof. But the total number of vehicles on the road is still very low because there's a lot of vehicles that aren't getting replaced every year, right? It's something like 6% of vehicles turn over annually in California. I think maybe less than that, maybe 5%. So, 15% of 5% is basically 0% of the total number of vehicles on the road are EVs. All right, thanks so much, Chris. Appreciate the presentation. Next up, we have Laura Raymond from Alliance for Community Transit, Los Angeles. Take it away, Laura.
Hey, everyone. It's great to be here. I have some slides as well. So I'm just going to share my screen. Let me see if I can figure out how to do that. There we go. All right. Okay. So thanks for having me, first of all. I really appreciate being here with everyone. It was a super important conversation and really happy to be able to join the dialogue. This is ACT LA is our coalition. We're actually 41 organizations in LA County. And our membership ranges from grassroots, organizing groups, community development corporations, so affordable housing, builders, and more like policy groups. A lot of our members are neighborhood based and all over, especially the city of LA, and then we have some members throughout the county and other cities as well. And our mission, we formed in 2011, and our mission is here. It strives to create community transit, and we have a very, very expansive mission, right? So we are looking at the transit system, but really neighborhoods as well, and making sure like we're being very intersectional and making sure we are creating that world-class transit system that places the interests of low-income communities and communities of color first as we create a more sustainable city. And given LA's history of development, we think it's really critical that we are centering equity and prioritizing communities that have been left behind for so long. And this is a critical context that our work takes place in. We are really transforming the region through a massive build out of our transit system through two sales tax measures, measures R and M. We're making a $160 billion investment in transit throughout the county. So Metro has jurisdiction over all 88 cities and unincorporated LA. And it's the largest infrastructure project in the nation. As a mayor of LA, I like to say by far. And so we've got tons, I've got some photos here, but this is really the scene all over. LA is a lot of transit-oriented development going up, a lot of new stations. We're actually redesigning our bus network right now as well, with new major transit stops rolling out this month. And the other critical context that this is taking place in is a very protracted housing crisis in the county. LA County, when you factor in incomes, is actually the least affordable rental market in the country. We have the highest rate of overcrowding. We also have the highest rate of unsheltered homelessness among major cities, where the metro area is the greatest percentage of renters in the country. And pre-Prop JJ, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, our transit-oriented development, so what we were building residentially around transit, was very much geared for higher income households, and only 2% of non-subsidized new units were affordable to low income households in 2014. We're also rapidly losing affordable units, especially around transit. And this should be concerning at face, but also when we're talking about transit and getting people out of their cars. I'll talk about, let me see here, my next slide. Who is using transit in LA is very, very relevant here. About 70% of our regular public transit commuters make $35,000 or less per year, and 90% are people of color. So we have a transit dependent population that's extremely low income, very low income, and they're particularly vulnerable to displacement. So, ACLA's analysis has always been when we're building units around transit that aren't geared specifically for transit riders, we're really missing a huge opportunity to stabilize and build housing for people that are going to use our system. And so in already who's living around transit, Angelenos within a half mile of transit stops, they're more likely to rent, they're more likely to be transit dependent, and are lower income than Angelenos overall. So our urban core that's very transit rich is also tends to be very low income as well, or more compared to other areas of Los Angeles. And as we're investing $160 billion, our ridership is dropping, and it has been dropping for the past 20 years. And that's very complicated. There's a lot of reasons why that's happening, including car ownership going up, but also gentrification and displacement is one of the reasons we're hearing from our members that they're losing membership. Churches, faith communities are losing members as well, because they're getting pushed out of the urban core. So that's relevant to how ACLA came to be. As a coalition, we formed in 2011 really as a labor of love of a lot of community organizations that saw this dynamic happening and said, we really need to get on top of this, and we really need to start working at this intersection of transportation, public transit, and housing, and affordable housing specifically. And why is this relevant to state climate goals, given the conversation we're having tonight, is while just 5% of trips in the Southern California region, so SCAG counties, all of Southern California beyond LA, while just 5% throughout the region around transit, this actually accounts, because we're so population heavy here, this actually accounts for 50% of the state's public transit trips. So, we need to really focus here on getting more people out of their cars onto the transit system, and that could have a very big impact overall in the state, how we're commuting, right? And I noted here, this is a huge source of the state's emissions are from transportation uses. I'm sure Chris could go into more details there. So we also, this is it's a hopeful time in a certain sense, because there is so much focus on this investment in Southern California in terms of a lot of revenue coming in for transit, and a lot of new rail lines being built, new bus stops. We're building out our bus system and adding service hours. Well, I mean, that has changed this year, and I can talk more about that. folks have questions, but there's potential here to stabilize and increase the viability of transit trips for more people in Southern California. And so this is really kind of various aspects of how we work. So we, at ACT LA, we work on development strategies. So we focus on housing justice, and we're really centered on core transit riders, so very low income folks who tend to be communities of color or who are core transit riders, by ensuring deeply affordable housing production and preservation. We also are think about jobs and what kind of economic opportunities for local residents. So for example, at LA Metro, we work with the unions, we work with worker centers. Some of our members are worker centers to really make sure as we're developing out the region, both through transit and housing, we're creating economic opportunities and raising the living wage. And also, you know, we do work directly on the transit system. So looking especially about quality service for our bus rider majority. Over 70% of LA Transit users are bus riders primarily. And so that kind of all feeds into this goal of avoiding displacement, maintaining healthy communities, and stabilizing and growing our transit ridership. And we really think we need all three pieces here. And this is our model, just real quick. We've got 41 organizations. We work through committees. Our committees have both policy experts, organizers, and advocacy staff. So we work in a range of different tactics to work on campaigns. And so I just wanted to talk about some of our campaigns so far, just to give folks some example of the types of policies we worked on. So in 2016, we worked on what was called Measure JJJ, which led to the transit-oriented communities policy in Los Angeles. And that basically, the proposal we made to voters, it was a ballot initiative, and we said we're gonna build more densely around transit. So really make sure that we're using land around major transit stops to build more densely. And developers will have that ability to change zoning, build more densely in exchange for including affordable housing in the units. And that campaign won with 64% of the vote. I like to think that this shows the appetite for voters and the general public in LA to support dense housing around transit, and also support affordable housing. And it won despite an opposition campaign from the development community, as well as, you know, we didn't have any support from City Hall. The LA Times opposed it because they thought it wasn't feasible, that we were asking for too much from developers. And in fact, that was off, because our program is now in place. It's generated over 35,000 overall units through this incentive program, of which 7,500, more than 7,500 are affordable, and many of those are extremely low income. And in fact, we just had a USC study that showed that we could be even asking for more affordable housing in those buildings in many areas of Los Angeles. So we could even be getting more affordability. Measure JJJ also made some requirements of having baseline affordability in community plans and transit plans as well. In 2017, we worked to defeat anti-development Measure F, which would have killed a lot of affordable housing around transit. We led the voter engagement operation, co-led it with our labor partners. And we also, you know, we worked on a linkage fee that passed through City Hall, and we worked on fair housing plans for the city and county. And then in 2018, we worked at Metro on a transit-oriented communities policy, which really sets out goals for Metro's community development activities. It reclassifies TOC activities as transportation uses, so things like federal dollars can now be used for things like affordable housing production and preservation. And we've worked on an extensive policy implementation plan with Metro over the past couple of years since it passed in 2018, which is going to put millions of Metro dollars into assisting local cities on improving their housing policies. So we see a lot of opportunity there for beyond the city of LA to work with the other 88 jurisdictions in LA County to change housing policy and have better development policy around transit, and especially geared towards affordable housing and tenant protection. And so now what we're working on through equitable development, actually is kind of divided into different committees. Some work on equitable development, some work on transit justice specifically. Our equitable development team is, we're supporting our community housers. Like I said, a lot of our members actually build housing or local community development corporations like Thai CDC, Little Tokyo Service Center, Venice Community Housing. And then we're also working on some new bold models. So thinking through how do we really scale up to the amount of affordable housing we need? We have like hundreds of thousands of gap in affordable housing units in the county. So how are we going to reach scale? Looking at things like social housing for Los Angeles and really focusing on getting various income levels near transit to really serve our transit riders. Of course, centering racial and economic justice in everything we do and being really grounded in the history of development in Los Angeles and needing to turn the tide. And that includes like environmental justice. A lot of, the way that LA has built out and the highways here, it's like our most polluted communities are communities of color. Fair housing and land use planning is like a big focus of ours as well. I don't want to take too long, so just wanted to show a few more slides and photos of just the work we're doing. We're working on LA's 35 community plan updates and 3 neighborhood plans through a planning for equity program. So we actually train trainers, train community groups to get involved in land use planning. We're going to be doing that more through Metro's TOC policy as well. And then working at Metro, so this is a photo of us at Metro headquarters. We're doing a lot on transit specifically, like improving bus service and changing how safety is approached on transit and doing a lot of budget work at Metro. But we're also, like I said, we're working on housing. Metro owns a lot of land. And it's a very important strategy for better housing policy in LA. So we work on the TOC policy and the joint development policies at Metro. And then really across the board, new revenue sources. We need a lot more money for affordable housing. And so we're working on new revenue sources. This is us testifying at the Board of Supervisors on a purchase office idea that they're exploring. And then a lot of community engagement, making sure that folks throughout LA and in our member organizations are very much engaged in driving these conversations. And we're staying very much rooted in what's happening on the ground and what working class people in this county are experiencing, and making sure we're being very responsive to that. And cross-sector collaboration, we do a lot of work. Again, with our labor partners or with worker centers, with environmental justice groups, and know that these issues are intersectional. And so we have to be working intersectionally. That's a bit about our work and how we're seeing this intersection with climate justice, getting housing right near transit, and of course, improving our transit systems themselves. So I'll just pause there. Happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you, Laura. We've got a few questions coming in right now. I'm just putting the link in the chat if anybody else has questions. And I'll go ahead and Laura, we have a couple of questions I want to ask you. One, someone was looking for data on ridership stats for LA. Is that available from LA Metro on their website somewhere you can recommend? Or do you have a
yeah, I'm sure it is. They report out, and so it could be buried in the board reports, but it is. But if you folks want to or Ben, if you want to email me later, I could dig it out.
Okay, I think probably under like a strategic plan or some sort of annual reports kind of thing. I'll see you the question more detailed.
Also, the LA Times has reported on it recently, so you could just also look for articles from LA Times on it. All right.
Yeah. We had a question for you asking, can you explain what you mean by social housing and talk about for equitable housing development? And I don't remember what happened to it, but I think there was a bill this year in the state legislature to look into creating a sort of a state social housing organization. Maybe touch on that a little as well.
Yeah, my understanding is that bill is now a 2-year bill. And what we mean, it's a great question, because social housing is used by different people meaning different things. And with Act LA, we're actually in a process with our members to define it for our coalition, like what we think we mean for LA as a coalition that focuses on housing. But you know, around the world, there's successful social housing models like Singapore, Vienna, other places in Europe that actually fund mixed income. It's the government funded mixed income housing. And a lot of different folks live in government provided housing and, you know, pay rent at levels suitable for their household. So that's basically the idea, is to have like a new system. It'd be different than public housing in the past, funded differently, but it doesn't exist right now in Los Angeles or California. You know, it's like a lot of people are trying to figure out what this could look like. So it's a new concept, and but it's a new concept, but also, you know, there are models around the world that are very interesting that folks are looking at, and that's part of what this state bill is doing, is looking at different models.
Yeah, my understanding for social housing is that it's basically like a state or local agency that builds housing, can basically compete with private developers, but because they're a public agency, they don't have to make a profit. So they can usually put more on affordable housing, provide more community benefits. And I think the University of California system is one example of social housing we have in California, because the student dorms are, you know, government-owned housing run for anybody regardless of income levels, essentially, with subsidies available for low-income students. So that's one sort of example we have right now. Another question for you, Laura, we got is, what elements does Act LA look at when evaluating state housing legislation?
Yeah, I mean, we have gotten involved in the past. We're obviously a county-focused coalition, so we've gotten involved in the past on some state housing bills. We don't, you know, we're not a coalition that weighs in on every bill. It's really like if something's impacting what our work is moving forward in Los Angeles. So that's really how we evaluate things. Or is this going to benefit what we have in place here, or disrupt it in a way that we are concerned about, right? So, you know, some of the, we did weigh in on SB 50, which was one of the big ones that folks always ask us about, because of how we viewed it interacting with things like our TOC policy and our community plan updates and things that we were working on here, and suggested a lot of amendments to that based on, you know, our read of what we thought was needed in LA and would build off and improve what we have locally, rather than disrupt it in a negative way. So yeah, and then, you know, we've been working a lot this year on rent debt and making sure folks can stay in their homes after COVID, because of just a lot of people being out of work and still racking up rent debt and having just a lot of concern about being evicted when the eviction protections are lifted. And so we were doing a lot of work this year on SB 91, and particularly, you know, after it moved through the state, because that was a very quick process. But we, you know, when it came to LA, like how SB 91 would be implemented here, and then sending feedback to like what we thought the huge gaps were with that kind of tenant protection, how that was set up.
Great, thank you. I think it's a great segue to our next speaker, Cassidy Denny from State Senator Scott Wiener's office. And for a little bit of context, after our speakers are done presenting, we'll be breaking it into 3 breakout rooms to discuss 3 of the big state land use bills this year: SB 9 from Senator Atkins, SB 10 from Senator Wiener, and AB 1401 from Assemblymember Friedman. Cassidy will go into more detail on these bills, which is a brief touch on them. SB 9 would allow duplexes anywhere zoned for single-family zones housing in California right now. SB 10 would allow cities to zone for up to 10 units per parcel in areas near transit. And AB 1401 would remove parking requirements near transit throughout California as well. And Cass will go into more detail, but she's going to explain those bills to us as best she can. And then we'll have 3 breakout rooms to help all of us discuss and share ideas and thoughts and considerations around those bills. All right, Cassidy, take it away.
Cool. Well, first, thank you all for having me. I'm really excited to be here. As Ben said, I work in Senator Wiener's office. I'm his housing staffer. So I personally staff SB 10, whereas the other two, since they're not our bills, I just know of them being in the housing world. So yes, AB 1401, that one is in the Senate now. It passed the Assembly last week, and it will be heard in Senate Housing Committee. I don't think it's been set yet, but it'll be heard soon. And so that one prohibits the local government from enforcing a minimum parking requirement for developments located near public transit. And so, I mean, it's essentially exactly how it sounds. Mandatory parking minimums have been shown to lead to an oversupply of parking spaces, which can be burdensome for housing development. And so Assemblymember Friedman wants to tackle this issue and had this standalone bill. SB 9 is Pro Tem Atkins' bill. It's a rerun of SB 1120 from last year. It's almost identical to last year's bill. There's just a few amendments that I know California YIMBY has requested that are in there. I know the realtors have requested a few. But it's substantially the same as last year's 1120. And last year that bill actually passed both houses and then did not get to the governor's desk off of a technicality deadline issue where we couldn't get it out of the Senate fast enough to meet the midnight deadline. So it actually did pass both houses, but then ended up not getting to the governor's desk. So that one allows for duplexes where single family homes are currently located in urbanized areas. I know there's a very high fire zone exemption and there's a couple other exemptions in the bill as well, but essentially urbanized areas would be ministerially approved for duplexes, or you can also split the lot if it's a certain square footage and then do a duplex on both sides of the lot. So this would only allow for 4 units maximum. I know a lot of people think it's 6, 8, 10. There's a lot of mailers that go out saying this will allow 10 units. It's very clear in the bill that it's only 4 maximum, and that's only if you split the parcel. So it's 2 per parcel. And then SB 10 is also a rerun of SB 902 from last year, which was held in Assembly Appropriations. And SB 9 is actually in Assembly Local Government. It will be heard tomorrow. And then after Assembly Local Government, it will be going to Assembly Housing. So just status-wise, that's where it is. SB 10 is a rerun of SB 902 from last year. That one was held in Assembly Approps. And so my boss reintroduced it this year. Again, substantially the same as last year. It allows for a local government, totally voluntary, only if they want to rezone parcels up to 10 units. Does not have to be 10, just up to 10 if they choose. And they can take that rezoning out of CEQA. And then it's limited to transit areas and urbanized areas as SB 9 is. So again, that one's completely voluntary. We're not making the local government do it. It's only if they want to, and it's allowing them a streamlined benefit of this rezoning, which can be costly and timely and overall not very pro-housing and supportive of housing. And so our bill would just simply allow that rezoning to be taken out of CEQA if the local government passes an ordinance saying that they want it to. And that one has not been set yet in Assembly Local Government, but it will be soon. And then after Assembly Local Government, it will go to Assembly Housing. So sort of the same track as SB 9. So those are the 3 bills. And we can talk about them in more detail in the breakout rooms. But I did also want to just touch on the housing kind of environment as a whole at the state level, like in the Capitol building. It's different than how it was. I think we're seeing a really cool shift. I think it started in 2017, where there's a core group of members that are elected and now in the legislature that have put housing as one of their top priorities. And so for the first time in a while, we have this core group that all care about housing issues and they all want to champion housing. And so started in 2017 with the first housing package then, which SB 35 was a part of, and a few other Pro Tem Atkins bills. And we saw how influential those have been and how successful a lot of those have been, especially SB 35. And so last year, we created another housing package And I believe the assembly also had their own housing package, but it was just it was put together after the bills passed the assembly, so it didn't get as much media attention. But they also had one as well. And so, unfortunately, none of the Senate housing package bills from last year made it to the governor's desk. There were a few assembly bills that did. So they're all reintroduced this year. Senator Skinner, I believe Senator Durazo has one, Senator Caballero, my boss, Senator Wiener, Pro Tem Atkins. I believe Senator McGuire has one in the package. So it's this core group of members that have all decided that we want to do something about housing. And so we've sort of separated bills out, each tackling different issue areas that pertain to the housing crisis and trying to get at it that way instead of like SB 50, one gigantic bill that tries to solve all the problems in one. While that was great to get the conversation going and really like thread the needle and move the goalposts, it didn't pass. And so we're hoping that by separating them out in a more succinct way, that we can be more successful. And I think we would have been successful last year, but then COVID happened and we had a bill limit and all the deadlines kind of got messed up. So all those bills are reintroduced this year into the 2021 Senate housing package. And yeah, I mean, I think all of the bills in the housing package and all of the other housing bills that we see in the assembly, those members that have decided to champion them are really thoughtful about the intersections between climate, racial justice, gender equality, home ownership versus rental. And so we're all taking that into account in each of our separate bills and also in the greater picture of the package as a whole. How can we ensure that this increases racial equity and not decreases it, racial injustices, make sure that we address those in home ownership, in rental protections, in affordable housing, in transit policy, making sure that our climate goals are not being negated by our housing policy. While a housing bill could look good on the shallow surface level, like Chris said, we want to make sure that while we are encouraging, urban infill, jobs-rich, transit-rich development, we're also at the same time discouraging sprawl, because otherwise these bills that are good on the surface don't actually have the impact that we want them to. So I think everyone has been really mindful of that as we're creating the housing package and as we are each individually authoring our own bills within that. So yeah, I'll stop there, see if there are any questions.
Great, thank you, Cassidy. We have gotten a couple of questions and the links in the chat for anybody else to submit questions as well. The first one is sort of a technical question. What's the definition of urbanized areas for these bills? And I'll also throw in, what's the definition of transit in these bills as well, since that's relevant too?
Yep, so I believe for SB 9 and 10, it is the urbanized census. There's an actual, let me look it up really fast, but it's an actual term and it's defined what constitutes as urban infill. And it's pretty widely used, and that's also in SB 9, it's the same definition.
Got it, yeah. I have it open. An urban infill site is a site that's a parcel located in a city if it is included in urban areas defined by the census. A site in which 3/4 of the perimeter is adjacent to other urban uses, a site that's zoned for residential or mixed-use development, et cetera. So generally well.
So basically no rural, no agriculture. SB 9 and 10, I believe, have both exempted very high fire hazard zones. So none of those zones either. So we want to make sure that they're limited to urbanized areas where like lots of people are essentially. And then transit rich, I'm not sure of the 1401 definition. I believe it's half a mile from a transit center is 1401's definition. And then ours is similar, where we define a high quality bus corridor and what that means. And then it also says a half mile within a major transit stop. And so we have those definitions in the bill. So that's very clear. You can't just say like, oh, this is 5 miles from a bus stop, that counts as transit rich. So we've again tried to craft a lot of these bills where they're specific to what we're intending, so they can't be abused.
Yeah, and I think like a high quality service is like every 15 minutes or something like that.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. So it's during peak hours, every 15 minutes, And then I think during non-peak hours, it's every 20 minutes or 30 minutes. So it defines it like that.
Great, great. We've got a number of questions here as well, and I'll try to summarize them basically. How do you see, especially SB 9 and 10, but probably 10 since that's what we're working on, how do you see those fitting in with affordable housing production, right? We used to have some concerns about how do we ensure these bills don't cause displacement or gentrification of working class neighborhoods? How do we get more affordable housing built? How do they intersect with the existing affordable housing state laws and local policies and programs? Can you touch on that? How's that? Where's the linkage there?
Yeah, of course. So I'm not as familiar with SB 9, but I know that there is displacement language in SB 9, and there are requirements for what cannot be built. Like a duplex cannot be built on a site if it is A, B, C, or D. And so I know there are requirements that specifically address that, since that would be a mandate. Whereas SB 10, since it's voluntary, ours is worded a little bit differently, but all current laws and requirements that you would need to follow still apply. So for instance, we have a provision in there that says the increased zoning the local government must show in their ordinance that they increase the zoning, that it's still affirmatively furthering fair housing. Housing Accountability Act provisions apply. And so we've been working with the Western Center to ensure that there aren't unintended consequences of displacement with these bills. And so ensuring that the local government has thought these things through before they pass this ordinance. Same thing with like the Coastal Commission and the Coastal Act. Because it's voluntary, the local government would still need to submit their local coastal act to the Coastal Commission, and that would still need to be approved. And it's exempting very high fire zones unless the local government already has mitigation measures in place. So being very mindful of, while we do understand it's only up to 10 units, and a lot of times affordable housing developments are a lot larger than that, we believe that there's this missing middle type of housing that does need to be built to also help with our housing crisis. It's not going to be the end all be all. It's not going to be the only thing that gets us out of it, but it is going to be a piece of it. And so SB 9 and 10, I think, speak to that specifically, with SB 9 being duplexes and then SB 10 only being up to 10 units. And having those either displacement measures already in the bill or the local displacement measures still in place.
Got it. And then, yeah, I also wanted to add in there, it sounds like for SB 10, I think the state density bonus kicks in at 10 or plus units. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So for a city, it isn't zoned for 10 units near transit. They could up zone to 10 units, and then developers could actually build 10 units and get on-site affordable housing with a density bonus. Whereas if they're only allowed to do 2 or 4 units, there's no affordable housing going to go in there in the first place. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So sometimes there's no provisions for requiring it, but it does sort of create a path, and it's more focused on the missing middle, 2 to 10 unit size apartments that are generally more affordable by design, but not explicitly like means tested, subsidized affordable housing.
Right. And because SB 10 is not project specific, so we are just focusing on the plan level of this rezoning. We don't speak to any project requirements, and that is completely up to the locals. In past years, my boss has done the opposite, where we tried to mandate that, and we do have project specific requirements in it, but this bill is a different approach where it's just the plan level. Mm-hmm. And so we are leaving it up to the locals to decide what goes in.
So local government could say, we're going to take SB 10 and upzone to 10 units, but we're going to require 20% affordable housing on site if you do more than 5, for instance.
Right.
They could do that if they wanted to. Great.
Yeah,
cool.
They could do 100% of 10 unit affordable if they wanted to.
Yeah, like affordable housing upzoning, basically, kind of thing.
Right.
Great. All right, we've used a lot of time, and I want to make sure we have time for breakout rooms. So we're going to be going ahead and doing that right now. And Michael will be leading the SB 9 breakout room, right? I'll be taking the SB 10, and then Marie from 350 San Diego will taking AB 1401. I think, Laura, you said you can't stick around. Is that correct? All right, well, thank you for joining. We've been just really good to having you.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I will share any of the other questions, and maybe we can get some of that data and we'll get it sent out if everyone who attended this meeting. And then Cassidy, I think, will be available in the SB 10 breakout room to help answer questions and be involved there. And Chris, I think you want to join SB 9 breakout room. Is that correct? Great. And then so just for a little bit more context, San Diego has actually removed parking minimums near transit. So they've already effectively implemented a version of AB 1401. So hopefully Marie or anybody else in 350 San Diego can help answer questions around that. So I think the breakout rooms are open. Is that correct? Can everybody join the breakout rooms? Do you have that option or?
Yep.
So, okay, so feel free to go ahead and join breakout rooms if you see that in the lower right bottom of the screen.